Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Tomb of Tamerlane. The year is 1941. You're standing inside one of the most beautiful buildings in Central Asia, and the smell is wrong. The mausoleum of Guri Amir has been sealed for 5 centuries, and the air that greets you at the vault entrance is dense, ancient, not decayed but stopped, like the compressed atmosphere of a place that has not breathed since the medieval world was alive. Your team is preparing to move a slab of dark green nephrite jade that has not been touched since 1405, the outer grave marker of Timur, the man history knows as Tamerlane. It is the largest piece of jade in the world. The date is June 19th. You are a member of Mikhail Gerasimov's expedition team, and the elders of Samarkand are outside with a manuscript you have been told not to read. Timur died in 1405 on a military campaign in what is now Kazakhstan, still planning the invasion of China at age 68. During his lifetime, he conquered a territory stretching from Anatolia to Delhi, from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, leaving in his wake the skulls of defeated enemies piled into towers that travelers documented for generations. Modern historians calculating from population data estimate that his campaigns killed approximately 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's total population at the time. No military commander in recorded history killed a higher proportion of living humanity. He was, by that single metric, the most destructive human being who ever lived. Mikhail Gerasimov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated forensic anthropologist, has come to reconstruct his face from the bones. The elders of Samarkand have been arriving at the site for days, carrying a handwritten manuscript in Persian, copied and preserved across generations for the specific reason of what it contains. They translate the warning inscription for the Soviet team. Whoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I. Gerasimov considers this. He is a scientist with state authorization and Academy of Sciences funding. He orders the jade slab moved. Below it is a sealed burial vault. The team descends. In the vault is a skeleton in remarkable preservation. Gerasimov measures it with the precision for which he is known throughout Soviet science. The right leg is shorter than the left, exactly consistent with the historical accounts of Timur's appearance that described him walking with a pronounced limp from an arrow wound sustained in early battle. The man in the sarcophagus is the man they came for. Gerasimov photographs every bone, records every dimension, takes samples. His facial reconstruction from these measurements, completed over the following weeks, was later described by scholars as one of the finest achievements in the history of forensic anthropology, a portrait so accurate that experts comparing it to contemporary miniatures of Timur agreed on its likeness. That work began in this vault, on the night of June 19th and the early morning of June 20th. Here's where it gets strange. On June 22nd, 1941, 3 days after the tomb was opened, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 3.5 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory simultaneously along a front stretching 1,900 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest military invasion in the history of the world, surpassing in its scale anything that Tamerlane had ever assembled. The Soviet Union, which had not been at war when Gerasimov descended into the vault on June 19th, was now fighting for its survival against a force that in its early months appeared to be doing exactly what the Persian inscription had said, arriving as an invader more terrible than the man in the ground. The story spread through Central Asia with the speed of things that feel true regardless of whether they are. By autumn of 1941, as German forces advanced toward Moscow and the Soviet position deteriorated on every front, it had reached Stalin. What Stalin privately believed about curses is not a matter of historical record. What is a matter of historical record is what he ordered. In November 1942, by direct command from the Soviet leadership, Tamerlane's remains were returned to the vault. Full Islamic burial rites were performed by the Muslim clerics of Samarkand. The ceremonies that had been interrupted in June now completed according to proper tradition. The sarcophagus was resealed. 2 months later, in February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. It was the decisive turning point of the Eastern Front, the moment from which the German military never recovered. The invader that had entered as something more terrible than Tamerlane had reached his limit. What to make of this sequence depends entirely on what you allow yourself to consider. Operation Barbarossa had been in planning since December 1940, 6 months before Gerasimov's team touched anything in Samarkand. The war was produced by ideology, strategy, and Hitler's conviction about Eastern expansion, not by the position of a medieval conqueror's remains. The dates align, the causation does not. But consider what Gerasimov confirmed in that vault. The lame leg, the war wounds, the facial reconstruction so precise that 20th century photographs of the result appear alongside 14th century portraits as companion images. The manuscript the elders carried had not been written for the occasion. It had been copied across 15 generations by people who, in each generation, judged it important enough to keep. Stalin, the man who had dismantled every religious institution in the Soviet Union and imprisoned its clergy, ordered Islamic burial rites performed over a Mongol conqueror's bones. He ordered it in November 1942. Stalingrad was in February 1943. Whether he thought those two events were connected is preserved in no surviving document. What is preserved is the sequence. Nobody sealed that tomb back up until after it started looking like maybe the elders with the manuscript had known something. Number 2. Tutankhamun's tomb. The year is 1922. You're holding a candle inside a sealed doorway in a hillside that has been closed since 1323 B. C. Watching Howard Carter make a hole in the plaster just large enough to see through. The air that escapes when the plaster first cracks is unlike anything you've encountered. Not decay, not dust, something older than both. A sealed atmosphere released for the first time in 3,245 years. Carter inserts the candle. His head goes through the gap. Lord Carnarvon, standing beside him in the cramped passage, asks what he can see. Carter is silent long enough that Carnarvon asks again. What Carter eventually says is what he would later write in his diary verbatim, wonderful things. The date is November 26, 1922. The tomb of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BC, and died at about 19 years of age from causes still actively debated, had been sealed beneath the stone chips of a later construction project in the Valley of the Kings, effectively invisible for 32 centuries. Howard Carter, a self-taught archaeologist from Swaffham, England, had spent 6 seasons searching for it with funding from George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, an English aristocrat who had come to Egypt for his health following a serious automobile accident. The team had been digging for 4 days when a worker found a stone step. The morning of the opening, one of Carter's men noted that the small bird cage he kept at the dig house, a yellow canary he had brought to the valley as a good luck charm, was silent. When he checked, a cobra was inside the cage. The canary was gone. Cobras in ancient Egypt were the symbol of the pharaoh's protection, the uraeus worn on the royal crown to strike down enemies. Carter's men noted the timing. Carter did not. Lord Carnarvon returned to England in December 1922 to handle the legal and financial matters surrounding the discovery, then came back to Egypt in February 1923 for the opening of the burial chamber. On the 16th of that month, the inner chamber was breached. The gold of Tutankhamun's shrines filled the room floor to ceiling. Carnarvon stood in the presence of one of the most complete royal burials ever found. He was at the height of what would become the most famous archaeological discovery in history. He died on April 5, 1923, 5 months after the antechamber was first opened. The cause was blood poisoning, originating from a small wound on his cheek, a mosquito bite he had cut open while shaving. The wound became infected. The infection spread. He died at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo at the age of 56. Here's where it gets strange. At the moment of Carnarvon's death in Cairo, all the lights in the city went out simultaneously. The power failure was documented by the Egyptian Electricity Authority and reported by newspapers the following day as unexplained. In England, at Highclere Castle in Hampshire, Carnarvon's dog, a terrier named Susie, was heard by staff to howl at approximately the hour of her employer's death. Staff found her collapsed that same night. Susie was dead. These 2 events, the Cairo blackout and the dog's death, are reported across multiple independent contemporary sources and are not in question as facts. Their meaning is what remains open. Carter himself had told reporters he found a clay tablet in the antechamber bearing an inscription warning of death to those who disturbed the pharaoh. The story ran in newspapers worldwide. Carter later denied the tablet existed and said it had been invented by the press. The actual inscriptions found in the tomb were protective in nature, addressed to the guardians of the burial rather than threatening to intruders. The curse, as a written statement, does not appear to have existed in Tutankhamun's tomb. What did exist was the sequence of deaths. Arthur Mace, the archaeologist who assisted Carter in dismantling the outermost shrine inside the burial chamber, died in 1928 of unknown causes, his health deteriorating rapidly in the years following the excavation. Richard Bethel, who served as Carter's personal secretary throughout the dig, was found dead in his London club in November 1929, apparently of heart failure at 35. In February 1930, Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, leaped from the 7th floor of his London apartment building. The note he left referenced a cloud hanging over his family that would not lift. Think about what that means against the statistical record. A study published in the British Medical Journal in 2002 analyzed mortality rates among everyone present at the tomb's opening and found no statistically significant excess compared to a control group of similar demographics. The mathematics say the curse doesn't exist. Howard Carter, who opened the tomb and spent a decade working inside it, died of lymphoma in March 1939 at 64, an ordinary lifespan by his generation's standards. The numbers do not support a curse. The numbers also cannot explain why, at the precise moment Lord Carnarvon died in a Cairo hotel room on April 5, 1923, the city's electricity failed for no documented reason. A dog in Hampshire howled and collapsed, and the man who cut the hole in the wall outlived the man who paid for it by 16 years. The selection of who survived and who did not was not random. It was simply not explainable. What Tutankhamun's tomb cost the people who opened it was unevenly distributed. Some walked away with their lives and their careers. Others did not. What happened in Krakow 50 years later was not selective at all. In Krakow, the death rate was 12 out of 15, and it happened in months. Number 3. The tomb of Casimir IV Jagiellon. The year is 1973. You're a Polish scientist, and the first thing you notice when you descend into the royal crypt beneath Wawel Cathedral is the cold, a dry, bone-deep cold that has not moved in 5 centuries, carrying in it the faint metallic smell of very old enclosed stone. You're part of a team of 15 specialists, authorized by the Polish government to examine the burial of the man who ruled the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania for 45 years. The stone sarcophagus of Casimir IV Jagiellon has not been opened since it was sealed in 1492, the year Columbus crossed the Atlantic and the medieval world became the early modern one. You have the clearance, the equipment, and the professional reasons to be here. In 5 months, 12 of the 15 people in this crypt will be dead. Casimir IV Jagiellon ruled Poland and Lithuania from 1447 to 1492. He was one of the most consequential rulers in the history of Central Europe, defeating the Teutonic Knights, expanding Polish territory to the Baltic coast, and establishing a dynasty whose descendants occupied the thrones of Bohemia and Hungary. He died at 64 and was interred at Wawel, where Polish kings had been buried since the 11th century. The 1973 team was composed of specialists across disciplines: historians, archaeologists, forensic physicians, physical anthropologists, and conservation scientists. This was a state-authorized scientific examination, not an amateur excavation. 15 professionals descended into the crypt, examined the royal remains and associated grave goods, documented everything with the methods available in 1973, and returned to the surface. The first team member died within weeks. By the 6-month mark, 12 of the 15 were dead. The causes varied, which is what made it medically strange: cardiac events, respiratory failures, progressive infections, cancers that presented and advanced with unusual speed, systemic failures that the attending physicians documented but could not fully explain. 12 people from the same professional environment who had shared a single exposure event were dead within months of each other. Here's where it gets strange. Dr. Bolesław Smyk conducted the investigation. He took samples from inside the sarcophagus and submitted them for laboratory analysis. The results documented a compound biological hazard sealed inside the stone container for 500 years. Aspergillus flavus was present, a fungus that produces aflatoxins, mycotoxins that are among the most carcinogenic and immunosuppressive substances known to exist in nature. Also found, Aspergillus niger, Penicillium species in multiple variants, Clostridium bacteria, and elevated levels of radioactive dust consistent with the decay of radon, a gas that accumulates in sealed underground spaces over time, particularly in limestone environments like the one beneath Wawel Cathedral. The combination of fungal spores, bacterial agents, aflatoxins, and radioactive particles created an environment that, when the sarcophagus was opened, would have been inhaled by everyone present in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. The scientific explanation is real. It is documented. It is reproducible in the sense that any sealed medieval tomb containing organic material in a limestone environment might produce a similar result. On this reading, the deaths of 12 scientists are a textbook case of occupational biological hazard exposure predating the protocols that later became standard for such openings. And this is where the explanation becomes its own kind of problem. 15 people were exposed to the same environment in the same space over the same period of time. Biological hazards of the type Smike identified do not selectively target 12 people and spare 3. Aflatoxin exposure causes systemic damage across everyone who inhales sufficient quantity. The ventilation of the crypt, the duration of exposure, and the individual immune profiles of the scientists could all produce variation in severity. But 12 dead and 3 completely unaffected is not the expected distribution for a uniform exposure event. The 3 survivors were not younger. They were not documented as having left the space early. They were not wearing protective equipment the others lacked. They were simply alive when 12 of their colleagues were not. The precise reason why those specific 3 people survived when those specific 12 people did not has not been formally published in any scientific literature. The biological agents have been named. The mechanism has been proposed. The selectivity has not been explained. What Casimir IV took with him into that sarcophagus in 1492, or what accumulated there in the 5 centuries before the lid was moved in April 1973, was capable of killing. It did kill. The questions that remain are why it killed those 12 specifically, whether a king who had spent his reign managing large and complicated institutions understood that sealed stone and organic material in limestone were a long-term arrangement, and whether the cold, metallic air you inhaled on the way in was something you should have registered as a warning. The tomb at Wawel Cathedral is no longer accessible for examination. Its scientific file exists in Polish National Archives. The death toll is not in dispute. What waited inside a dead king's stone box for 5 centuries killed 12 scientists in 5 months. What waited inside an Egyptian hillside for 3,000 years was patient enough to wait 10 more years before the people who found it started paying for it. And unlike Casimir's tomb, someone went looking for that one on purpose. Number 4. The Deir el-Bahri Royal Cache. The year is 1871. You're Ahmed Abdel Rasul, moving through the limestone cliffs above the Nile before dawn, and the shaft you found in the rock face is deeper than any burial you've encountered in years of working this hillside. The torch you've lowered on a rope catches something at the bottom that stops you cold. Not stone, not pottery, faces. Multiple faces in the dark, wrapped and labeled, arranged in a passage cut from living rock. The smell that rises from the shaft is the smell of linen and cedar, and time compressed into a space that has been sealed for 3,000 years. You are looking at the most significant thing anyone in your village has ever found. You are also looking at a decision about what to do with it that will destroy everyone you involve in the answer. The Abd el-Rasul family lived in the village of Gurna, on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, built directly on top of the ancient necropolis. For generations, their community had known where to look in the cliffs. In 1871, Ahmed Abd el-Rasul discovered a shaft cut into the rock face, high above the valley of Deir el-Bahri, sealed and unmarked. Inside, arranged in a passageway and chamber carved from the limestone, were the mummified remains of more than 40 royal individuals from ancient Egypt's greatest dynasties. Placed there by ancient priests approximately 3,000 years ago, during a period of sustained tomb robbery when the Valley of the Kings was being systematically looted. The priests had gathered the royal mummies from their original tombs, rewrapped them, labeled them, and hidden them in this unmarked shaft to protect them. Ramesses II was there. Seti I was there. Thutmose III, the pharaoh whose military campaigns had defined Egyptian power at its height, was there. Amenhotep I, whose original tomb has never been found, was there. For 10 years, the family sold artifacts from the cache, slowly and carefully papyri, amulets, small funerary objects through Luxor dealers. Gaston Maspero, the French archaeologist serving as Director General of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, noticed unusual objects appearing in the market but could not trace their origin. In 1881, under sustained interrogation by Daoud Pasha, the Mudir of Cana, one family member broke and revealed the location. The man who had kept the secret for a decade was betrayed by his own brother. Émile Brugsch Bey, assistant to Maspero, descended the shaft by rope on the morning of July 6, 1881. In the torchlight at the bottom, looking down a passage lined with royal coffins, he later wrote that if the sky itself had fallen, he could not have been more astonished. He ordered the mummies removed within 48 hours, a decision driven by fear of theft and public exposure that was exactly as chaotic as removing 40 royal burials in 2 days sounds. Coffins were passed up ropes, carried on shoulders, loaded onto a Nile steamer. Here's where it gets strange. As the steamer carrying the pharaohs moved north along the Nile toward Cairo, something happened on both banks of the river that no official had expected. Villagers came to the water's edge for miles. Women threw dust on their heads and struck their faces the traditional Egyptian expression of mourning. Men fired rifles into the air in the ceremonial manner of grief. The mourning continued for hours as the boat moved north, the communities of the Nile Valley responding to the passage of the royal dead with a ceremony of loss that no one had organized or announced. 3,000 years after these pharaohs had last been seen by living eyes, the people of the Nile came to the banks and wept for them. The consequences for everyone connected to the discovery came quickly. Ahmed Abd el-Rasul, the man who first found the shaft and guarded the secret for 10 years, was found murdered in the desert within weeks of the cache becoming public. No suspect was identified. No investigation produced a result. Mohammed Abd el-Rasul, his brother who had informed on the family, was entirely ostracized by the community of Gurna. His neighbors refused to speak to him, trade with him, or acknowledge his existence. He died years later in poverty and isolation, with no grave of record, a man who had taken the location of the greatest royal cache in history and exchanged it for the remainder of a life in which no one would sit beside him. Émile Brugsch suffered a complete nervous breakdown in the aftermath of the removal and was unable to carry out professional duties for months. Colleagues described the event as having broken something in him that did not fully recover. Maspero, who organized the operation from Paris and arrived to find the mummies already in Cairo, was involved in a serious accident during his subsequent return to France and was kept from fieldwork for an extended period. The family had profited from the royal dead for 10 years. The man who guarded the secret was killed within weeks of ending it. The man who revealed it was erased from his community. The man who descended the shaft could not work. What was sealed in that cave 3,000 years ago by priests trying to protect the dead apparently had a clear view of what should happen to people who disturbed that protection. Whether the disturbers were thieves or officials made no apparent difference in the outcome. What ended the cache secret was betrayal. What ended the next burial on this list was gunfire. Number 5. The Tomb of the Lord of Sipan. The year is 1987. You're moving through the base of a mud brick pyramid at night in the Lambayeque Valley, a flashlight in one hand and a shovel in the other, and the adobe beneath your feet is 1,700 years old. You've been digging here in darkness for weeks. Tonight, the flashlight beam catches something that makes you stop. It's gold. Not a flake, not a fragment, a gold face mask the size of a dinner plate, finely worked, depicting a figure with fangs and an elaborate headdress, staring directly back at you from the ancient dark. You are the first person who has seen this face since the Moche civilization sealed it into this pyramid, approximately 250 AD. You are not an archaeologist. You are a grave robber from the nearby village of Sipan, and you have found the richest pre-Columbian tomb in the Western Hemisphere. You have approximately 3 weeks before someone shoots you. The Moche were one of the most artistically sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Americas, flourishing along the north coast of Peru from approximately 100 to 800 AD. They left no deciphered writing but left extraordinary ceramic art, sculptural pottery that depicts their world in vivid detail, their rituals of sacrifice, their ceremonies of royal power, and their precise understanding of what would happen to people who violated the tombs of their lords. The ceramics show it clearly and specifically. Those who disturb the dead are seized, stripped, dragged before the Lord, and taken apart. The Moche illustrated this fate with the same attention to detail they gave everything else. It is not a vague threat. It is an instruction manual. The Bernal family of Sipan had been probing Huaca Rajada, and in early 1987 broke through into a burial chamber containing gold and silver objects of extraordinary quality. They began removing artifacts and selling them through dealers in Lima. Within weeks, objects of obvious royal Moche quality were appearing in the Peruvian capital's antiquities market and attracting the attention of authorities who could recognize what they were looking at. When police moved to intercept the family at the site, Ernil Bernal was shot and killed in the confrontation. A second family member was killed in subsequent violence within the artifact network disputes over the division of loot that ended fatally. The Peruvian police contacted the Bruning Archaeological Museum in Lambayeque. Walter Alva, the museum's director, arrived at Huaca Rajada to assess the situation and began organizing a proper scientific excavation. He received his first death threat within days. Here's where it gets strange. The network of dealers and middlemen who had been profiting from the Sipan artifacts regarded Alva's presence as a direct threat to millions of dollars of business. His car was attacked. His colleagues received threats. At the excavation site itself, guards posted overnight to protect the tomb were found shot. Manuel Garcia Cordova, a guard stationed at the pyramid to prevent further looting, was murdered during the excavation period. Alva worked under police protection for the duration of what became one of the most important archaeological excavations in the history of the Americas. What Alva found in the undisturbed inner chamber of the Lord of Sipan's tomb exceeded every expectation that the initially looted objects had created. The Lord himself had been buried with a gold face mask covering his entire face, a crescent-shaped gold headdress nearly 2 feet across, copper sandals on his feet, a gold and silver backflap depicting a crab deity, and hundreds of ceramic vessels arranged around him. Beside him were the sacrificed bodies of 2 young women, their hands bound. Near the entrance were the bodies of a man and a child, and the skeletons of 2 llamas and a dog, each placed to accompany the Lord into whatever the Moche believed came after. The tomb contained more than 450 ceramic objects. Every element of the burial had been executed according to a cosmological plan. The Lord carried gold below the ground the way the sun carried light above it, and the people around him were his escorts into a world that needed a full royal retinue. The artifact dealers who had profited from the robbery were prosecuted across 3 countries. The Bernal family members, who survived, served prison time. The network of intermediaries moving Moche gold through Lima was dismantled. Walter Alva completed the excavation and survived it. He spent the following decade publishing the findings in collaboration with the Peruvian Institute of Culture. The Museo Tumbas Reales de Sipan opened in Lambayeque in 2002, built specifically to house the Lord of Sipan and his burial assemblage. He is there now, behind glass, his gold mask catching the museum light the way it caught the flashlight beam in 1987. The men who first found him, 1 shot dead by police, 1 killed in subsequent violence, 1 imprisoned. The dealers, prosecuted in 3 countries. The guard at his tomb, murdered. What happened to everyone in that sequence, the robbers, the intermediaries, the guard who stood between them, and the tomb, matches what the Moche ceramics predicted so specifically that you cannot tell, from the outcome alone, whether the legal system did it or whether something else did. 3 years before the grave robbers broke into Huaca Rajada, a very different kind of ancient burial was discovered on the other side of the planet. Not in a pyramid, not in a chamber, but in permafrost, on a high Central Asian plateau. And the woman inside it had been waiting just as long. Number 6. The Princess of Ukok. The year is 1993. You're Natalia Polosmak, a field archaeologist from the Novosibirsk Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography, crouching on a high plateau where the wind comes from 4 directions at once, and the permafrost is so deep that the ground beneath you has not thawed in 2,500 years. You're at 7,500 feet above sea level on the Ukok Plateau in the Altai Republic, near Russia's borders with Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan, one of the most remote landscapes on Earth. In front of you is a kurgan, a burial mound of the Pazyryk culture. a Scythian people who moved across Central Asia on horseback between approximately 500 and 300 BC. You've opened hundreds of burial mounds in your career. This one is different the moment your trowel hits the larch log coffin beneath the surface. It is packed solid with ice. The permafrost had reached the burial chamber at some point in the centuries after the woman inside was interred, and had been frozen there ever since. The ice had done what ice does over 2,500 years, which is preserve everything it touches with extraordinary completeness. When Polysmach and her team removed the wooden lid, what lay inside the larch coffin was not a skeleton. It was a woman who had been dead for 2.5 millennia and did not entirely look it. She was approximately 25 years old at death. She was wrapped in felt and silk, wearing a white blouse and a woolen skirt with a horizontal stripe, her feet in soft leather boots. On her left shoulder, visible through the textile wrapping, were tattoos. A deer with antlers that curved and then transformed into flowers at the tips, a mythological composite animal that the Alaric used to represent the transition between worlds. Additional zoomorphic figures ran along her right shoulder. Her headdress was a wooden framework nearly 3 feet tall, coated in felt, and decorated with carved golden griffins and wooden birds. 6 horses had been sacrificed outside the coffin and arranged around the kurgan in the positions they would have held as her escort. She had been buried by people who considered her important enough to accompany with gold, silk, and the lives of horses. Polysmach's team extracted the frozen sarcophagus and the funerary objects from the plateau and arranged transportation to Novosibirsk by helicopter for proper study. The helicopter carrying the mummy's sarcophagus experienced catastrophic engine failure over the Altai Mountains during the flight and was forced to make an emergency landing. A second helicopter had to be dispatched. The sarcophagus arrived in Novosibirsk intact. The Altai people learned what had happened. Here's where it gets strange. The response from the indigenous Altai community was immediate and collective. To the Altai people, the Ukok Plateau is a sacred zone, a place between worlds where the living do not disturb what the dead have been given. The woman in the larch coffin was not a research subject. She was an ancestor, possibly a shaman or healer, a woman placed in the high plateau to watch over the land and the people beneath it. Removing her was not scientific fieldwork. It was a desecration. In the weeks following the removal, severe and unusual flooding struck multiple regions of the Altai Republic. The helicopter failure during transport was followed by a second technical incident on a subsequent equipment run to the plateau. Local shamans performed ceremonies on the Ukok site, calling for the return of what had been taken. Protests from the Altai Republic government and indigenous community organizations escalated from local to federal level, with formal parliamentary resolutions demanding repatriation. On September 27, 2003, an earthquake measuring 7.3 on the Richter scale struck the Kashagaski district of the Altai Republic, the most powerful earthquake the region had recorded in the modern era. Scientists pointed to the area's tectonic activity. The Altai people pointed to the 10 years since the princess was removed from her plateau. Think about what that framing requires you to dismiss. The helicopter failure happened on the transport run. The floods came immediately after the removal. The earthquake came a decade into her absence. Whether each individual event has a geological or meteorological explanation does not address the question of why the sequence of events looked exactly like what the Altai people said it would look like. The legal and political dispute continued for years. The Russian scientific establishment cited the irreplaceable research value of the find. The Altai Republic Parliament cited the rights of indigenous people to their ancestral remains under international frameworks that were becoming more established through the 1990s and 2000s. In 2012, after nearly 2 decades of study and dispute, the mummy of the Princess of Ukok was repatriated. She now rests in a specially constructed, climate-controlled display case in the National Museum of the Republic of Altai in Gorno-Altaysk, where Altai authorities control access. The Altai people say the land has been quieter since her return. The Ukok Plateau does not comment. The tattoo on her shoulder, that deer whose antlers become flowers, is still being studied by researchers who require permission to see it. She is back in Altai. She is not available for questions. The man whose tomb comes next was not a young woman placed in ice by people who loved her. He was one of the most violent rulers in recorded history, and the person who spent his life finding his tomb died at the very site he discovered. Number 7. The tomb of Alaric the Visigoth. The year is 410 AD. You're a Visigoth soldier standing on the bank of the Busento River in southern Italy at midnight, watching hundreds of men redirect a river from its course. The sound of water being rerouted into a new channel is loud enough to cover other sounds, and the other sounds are the clink of Rome's treasury being lowered into exposed riverbed clay. Gold, silver, gemstones, liturgical objects accumulated over 8 centuries of Roman dominance. In the center of all of it is the body of Alaric, king of the Visigoths, who sacked Rome 3 months ago and is now dead of fever in a foreign country, 40 years old, having never reached the Africa he planned to conquer. When the burial is finished and the river is returned to its channel, every man who knows this location will be executed. You have been told this. You understand it. You watch the water come back. Alaric I led the Visigoths across the Roman frontier repeatedly through the late 4th and early 5th centuries, negotiating, raiding, demanding, navigating the final convulsions of a Western empire running out of capacity to manage its borders. On August 24th, 410 AD, his forces entered Rome. It was the first time the city had been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years. Rome did not fall that day. The empire continued for another 66 years, but the psychological rupture was total. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said the world itself had been conquered. Augustine began writing The City of God, partly in response. The sack of 410 was not the end of antiquity, but it was the moment antiquity understood it was ending. Alaric left Rome within days, headed south through Calabria with the treasury of the world and a plan to cross to North Africa. He died near Consentia, modern Cosenza, before the crossing could be arranged. He was 40 years old, at the peak of his military power, carrying the wealth of civilization, and he died of fever in the Italian south. The burial was recorded by the Gothic historian Jordanes in his work Getica, written around 551 AD, roughly 140 years after the event. According to Jordanes, the Busento River was diverted by prisoners of war. A burial chamber was constructed in the exposed riverbed. Alaric was interred with a significant portion of the Roman spoils. The river was returned to its channel, and every enslaved person who had participated in the construction was immediately executed. The location of the tomb died with the people who built it. That was the design. Here's where it gets strange. For 1600 years, the tomb has remained unfound. But what is strange is not the absence. An unmarked grave under a redirected river in the pre-GPS world is genuinely unfindable by conventional methods. What is strange is the pattern of destruction among the people who have seriously tried. In the 1930s, Benito Mussolini personally commissioned excavations along the Busento riverbed and the surrounding area of Cosenza. Teams searched for years. They found nothing. Within a decade, Mussolini was dead and his regime destroyed. During World War II, SS archaeological teams were dispatched to Cosenza in a search that combined military resources with the Reich's documented interest in recovering prestige objects from antiquity. They found nothing. The campaign that sent those teams ended in German defeat. The pattern repeats across the private expeditions of the following decades. A German treasure hunter who invested years in the search during the 1960s bankrupted himself and died having found nothing. An Italian expedition in the 1980s was shut down by legal action from the Italian Ministry of Culture, costing its organizers significant fines and professional consequences. Multiple individuals arrested over the years for illegal metal detector operations along the Busento have described financial and personal ruin following their prosecution. The river absorbs everything directed at it and returns nothing. The treasure Alaric took from Rome may include objects that had passed through multiple sacred traditions. Vespasian brought to Rome the contents of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the menorah, the golden table of shewbread. Those objects were in Rome in 410, and Alaric's men took what was in Rome. Where they went after 410 is one of the genuine unsolved questions of late antiquity. If they are in the riverbed at Cosenza, they have had excellent protection for 1600 years. In 2019, a team from the University Mediterranea of Reggio Calabria conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the Busento riverbed and the surrounding area. They identified anomalies at depth consistent with a buried structure. The survey was halted when funding ran out. It has not resumed. The tomb at Cosenza has not been found. What it has done is take down everyone who seriously looked. The Visigoth king built himself a tomb that cannot be approached without cost, and it has maintained that property across 16 centuries of searchers, none of whom were killed on the scale of what Leonard Woolley found in Mesopotamia, where the tomb itself had already arranged for 74 deaths long before anyone arrived to excavate it. Number 8. The Royal Tombs of Ur. The year is 1926. You're a member of Sir Leonard Woolley's excavation team, removing earth from the lowest level of what Woolley has designated Pit PG 1237 in the Royal Cemetery of Ancient Ur, and the lamps your team is using are throwing shadows across a field of skulls. They are arranged in rows. There are 68 of them in the main space, attached to bodies that lie on their sides in positions that suggest not struggle but sleep, each dressed in elaborate headdress and jewelry, each holding the remains of a small cup. There are 6 more near the entrance, 74 in total. This is a burial pit. The person or persons being buried required 74 people to come in here and die before the door was closed. You are looking at the most elaborate human sacrifice documented in Mesopotamian archaeology. The cups in their hands held something. They drank it and they lay down. They did not get up. Ur was one of the great cities of early human civilization, flourishing in what is now southern Iraq between approximately 2600 and 2000 B.C. Sir Charles Leonard Woolley of the British Museum, working under a joint British Museum and University of Pennsylvania Museum excavation permit. They began work at the site in 1922 and continued for 12 seasons through 1934. The royal cemetery he excavated represents the most significant collection of early dynastic Sumerian grave goods ever found. Among the thousands of burials documented, the Great Death Pit, his designation for PG 1237, was unlike anything else. The main occupant of PG 1237 has never been identified. No inscription in the pit names the royal dead, whose burial required 74 accompanying deaths. Every effort to determine the identity from the surrounding objects and the position relative to adjacent named burials has yielded nothing conclusive. The greatest human sacrifice in Mesopotamian archaeology was performed for someone whose name is lost. The 74 who died to accompany them, also unnamed. The goods in the pit were not modest. The musicians among the women had been buried with their instruments, a bull-headed lyre of gold and lapis lazuli, a pair of silver lyres, the harps that Woolley's team painstakingly documented and reconstructed. The headdresses the women wore were extraordinary, gold ribbons and leaves assembled into 3-dimensional arrangements that would have taken days to construct. Queen Puabi's tomb, found adjacent to PG 1237 and intact, contained her personal headdress, 4.5 pounds of gold leaves and rings, threaded with lapis lazuli and carnelian, in the same cemetery, the standard of Ur, a decorated wooden panel showing war and celebration on opposite sides, and the ram in a thicket, a gold and lapis lazuli sculpture so precise its original form was reconstructed from compressed fragments after 4,500 years. Here's where it gets strange. During the season in which the Great Death Pit was opened and fully exposed, 3 of Woolley's Iraqi workmen fell suddenly and severely ill with no diagnosis that held. One required immediate evacuation from the site. Woolley documented the illnesses in his field correspondence without identifying a cause. Catherine Woolley, who co-directed the excavation and was regarded by her husband and colleagues as indispensable to the project's success, began exhibiting behavioral changes during the later dig seasons that her colleagues described in private correspondence as frightening and increasingly irrational. She was eventually removed from an active role and later required psychiatric intervention. Her deterioration tracked directly with the years she spent on site at Ur. But the most significant irregularity connected to the Ur excavation has nothing to do with health. It has to do with the record. Scholars comparing Woolley's published final reports to his field notes, his excavation journals, and the preliminary communications he sent from the site have identified objects that appear in the field record and then disappear from the published inventory. Objects catalogued, described, and in some cases sketched in Woolley's field notes that do not appear in the definitive publications of the Royal Cemetery. The discrepancy is not explained in any published work by Woolley or by the British Museum, which holds the archive. Researchers who have formally noted the gap, including academic specialists in early dynastic Mesopotamian material culture, have received no institutional response that resolves what became of the absent objects. The gap exists in the permanent record of one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history, and it has never been formally addressed. Think about what that means in the context of what was found in those pits. Woolley spent 12 seasons excavating the most elaborate burial complex in Mesopotamian history. He documented it with meticulous care. He published extensively. And then, across the published record, specific objects that appear in his field notes are absent. The British Museum holds the archive. The archive has not been fully reconciled against the publications. Whatever Woolley chose not to publish about the royal tombs of Ur remains in the gap between a field note and a book, which in archaeology is the same as being buried. 74 people lay down in a pit with cups in their hands and waited in the dark for 4,500 years. The archaeologist who found them documented it all, published most of it, and kept something back. The man who found the next tomb on this list kept nothing back. He published every finding. He spent 35 years searching for a king's tomb and found it, and 3 years later, the tomb killed him. Number 9. The Tomb of Herod the Great. The year is 2007. You're Professor Ehud Netzer of Hebrew University's Institute of Archaeology, and you are standing on the slope of the Herodium fortress for what feels like the 10,000th time in 35 years. The Herodium is a remarkable structure, a man-made mountain in the Judean desert, 8 miles south of Jerusalem, a hilltop palace fortress built by Herod the Great in the 1st century BC, designed to be visible from Jerusalem and to announce his power to anyone traveling between the two cities. You have been searching for Herod's tomb inside and around this structure since 1972. You've proposed and rejected locations, published theories, followed tunnels that led nowhere, spent your entire professional life in the limestone of the Judean hills, looking for a man who died here in approximately 4 BC, and whose funeral the Roman Jewish historian Josephus described in specific detail. The golden bier, the purple coverings, the jeweled crown, the scepter, the procession of soldiers in full armor, the king being carried to Herodium by his family and his court. Josephus wrote it down. Josephus said, "He was buried here. You have been unable to find where." Herod the Great ruled Judea as a client king of Rome from 37 to 4 BC, one of the most politically skilled and personally brutal rulers of the ancient Near East. He built on a scale that still defines the physical landscape of Israel and Palestine, the Masada fortress, the port city of Caesarea Maritima, the complete reconstruction of the Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem, whose western wall still stands as one of the holiest sites in Judaism. He also killed his own sons, his wife Mariamne, and his mother-in-law, having received information or developed paranoia regarding various plots against him. He ordered, according to the Gospel of Matthew, the massacre of male children under 2 years old in Bethlehem after learning from the Magi that a king had been born there. He died of what ancient sources describe as a multi-system illness involving unbearable pain, putrefying flesh, and convulsions, which modern physicians retrospectively diagnosing from the description have proposed might have been chronic kidney disease, complicated by Fournier's gangrene. Josephus noted that no one mourned him. He was buried at Herodium, where at Herodium is what Netzer had spent 35 years trying to determine. In April 2007, Netzer's team was excavating on the northeast slope of the Herodium cone, not the interior of the fortress mound as previous searches had focused on, but the outer slope facing Jerusalem when they uncovered architectural remains consistent with a monumental staircase and a mausoleum structure. The scale of the stonework, the quality of the craftsmanship, and the position relative to the site matched what Josephus described. There was no inscription. Josephus did not mention one. But the building on the slope of the hill that could be seen from Jerusalem, built to the standard of Herodian construction, in the exact location consistent with the historical account. This was where Herod had been placed. The sarcophagus was not intact. It had been smashed into hundreds of pieces, an act of deliberate destruction that the stone itself made clearly intentional. The break patterns were not consistent with structural failure or collapse over time. The pink limestone had been struck repeatedly by force, fragmenting it comprehensively, a thorough and purposeful destruction of the burial vessel. Archaeological analysis placed the destruction in the period of the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 70 AD, when Jewish rebels fighting Rome would have had specific motivation to desecrate the tomb of the king who had been Rome's most successful collaborator in Judea. The man the rebels hated most had left them a monument to defile. They defiled it thoroughly. Herod's actual skeletal remains were not found anywhere in the mausoleum. Either the rebels destroyed them with the sarcophagus, or someone moved them beforehand. Here's where it gets strange. On October 28, 2010, Ehud Netzer traveled to the Herodium to visit the ongoing excavation of the mausoleum site he had found 3 years earlier. A wooden viewing platform or observation railing at the site gave way. Netzer fell. He was 76 years old. He was airlifted to Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem, the country's leading trauma hospital, and admitted with serious injuries. On November 1, 2010, Ehud Netzer died. He died at the site he had spent his entire professional life finding. The man who found Herod's tomb was killed at Herod's tomb. The excavation team continued under archaeologist Roy Poret, Netzer's colleague. In 2013, they uncovered elaborate painted frescoes inside the mausoleum structure, the most sophisticated decorative scheme yet found in any Herodian building. Panels of red, yellow, and blue in geometric and architectural patterns, preserved in fragments but identifiable as the interior decoration of a room Herod had designed to be magnificent. The murderous king who spent his reign building the beautiful had built himself a beautiful death room. His enemies smashed everything they could reach. The walls they couldn't break kept their colors for 2,000 years. Where Herod is remains unknown. His bones were not in the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was in hundreds of pieces. No secondary burial site has been found. The man who ruled Judea with sufficient force to hold it for 33 years, who built structures still standing 2,000 years after his death, who killed everyone he suspected of plotting against him, has no confirmed grave. The archaeologist who found his tomb fell from a platform at the tomb and died of the fall. Think about what that means in the context of everything else on this list. The next tomb was not found after 35 years of searching. It was found by accident, in 2018, by construction workers in Egypt. And the entire internet watched to see what would happen when they opened it. Number 10. The Black Sarcophagus of Alexandria. The year is 2018. You're a construction worker in the Sidi Gaber neighborhood of Alexandria, and the machine you're operating has stopped. Something under the ground at a depth of roughly 16 feet is harder than whatever else has been down there, and it is large. You dig around it. It takes time. What emerges from the soil is a sarcophagus of black granite, rectangular, sealed with mortar, approximately 72 inches tall and 104 inches long, larger than any sarcophagus previously found in the city of Alexandria. Whatever is inside has not been opened since the ancient world was alive. The date is June 2018. By July, the entire planet will be arguing about whether anyone should open it. Alexandria was the most cosmopolitan city in the ancient Mediterranean world, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC and developed by the Ptolemaic dynasty into the greatest center of learning, commerce, and culture the ancient world produced. It was also a city that buried its elite with specificity and record, a city where the wealth and identity of the dead were documented in the materials and inscriptions of their tombs. The black granite sarcophagus, found in the Sidi Gaber neighborhood, dated by initial assessment to approximately the 2nd century BC, the Ptolemaic period, the time when Alexandria was at its height. It had been sealed with mortar rather than mechanical fastening, which indicated it had not been opened since it was placed in the earth, and it had 3 holes sealed with gold. The photograph spread within hours of the discovery being made public. The response was global and immediate. Archaeologists noted the extraordinary scale of the find. The public noted the sealed mortar and the gold-stopped holes. The internet, which has strong opinions about what should happen when sealed ancient sarcophagi are found, organized itself into a position. Do not open it. Memes circulated. News articles appeared, quoting scholars' warning of biological hazards inside sealed ancient containers. A genuine international conversation developed about whether the responsible action was to open a 2,000-year-old sealed box or to study its exterior and leave the interior alone. Egyptian archaeological authorities opened it in July 2018. Inside the sarcophagus, in approximately 20 inches of red-brown liquid that had permeated the granite, through hairline cracks over 2,000 years of burial in the urban water table of a coastal Mediterranean city, were 3 skeletal remains. The liquid was sewage. Centuries of Alexandria's underground water had carried it into the sealed chamber gradually, until the sarcophagus that had been placed in the earth as a dry chamber was now a vessel of decomposed organic matter and contaminated water. The smell, by all accounts of those present, was significant. Here's where it gets strange. The bones told a story that no one had predicted. The female skeleton had a copper plate attached to her skull, in a position consistent with ancient trepanation surgical intervention into the skull, performed in the ancient world to relieve pressure from head injuries or treat neurological conditions. Trepanation was practiced across multiple ancient cultures, and the copper plate indicates she had survived the procedure, at least temporarily, since the bone showed signs of attempted healing around the edge of the copper. One male skeleton showed evidence of a healed wound consistent with an arrowhead penetration. The second male had healed fractures across multiple bones consistent with sustained serious physical trauma over time. These were not people who had led sheltered lives. They were people who had fought, or been fought, and who had survived long enough for the injuries to begin healing before they died of whatever killed them. Someone placed 3 violently scarred individuals inside the largest granite sarcophagus in Alexandria, sealed it with mortar and gold, and buried it 16 feet underground. No inscription on the exterior names them. No known document in the historical record of Alexandria describes this burial. The city that recorded everything about how it honored its dead apparently chose to honor these 3 in silence. Who were they, that their burial required the grandest possible container and no words? Shaban Abd Monem, one of the lead archaeologists involved in the opening of the sarcophagus, reported serious illness in the days following the event. The specific nature of the illness was not publicly detailed, and the connection to the opening was not confirmed medically. It was noted. The internet petition asking to be permitted to drink the contents of the sarcophagus, described by its more than 40,000 signatories as cursed juice, whose consumption would grant power or at least distinction, was declined by Egyptian authorities. This is, given the sewage content, the correct decision. The Black Sarcophagus of Alexandria now sits in Egyptian antiquities storage. Its 3 occupants have not been identified. The sarcophagus itself has not been conclusively dated or attributed to any known patron or burial tradition. The follow-up publication of the find has not appeared. What was sealed inside that granite for 2,000 years, opened to a crowd of cameras, produced red sewage, and 3 unnamed dead soldiers, and closed again into institutional silence. The mystery of who they were is identical to the mystery of who they were before the lid was lifted. The opening changed nothing. From the jade sarcophagus of Tamerlane to the red water of Alexandria, across 2,400 years of human history and 6 continents of geography, the same sequence repeats: a sealed burial, an act of opening, and consequences that no one entirely predicted. 10 tombs, 10 patterns. The same question every time, which is what exactly the dead want from the living who find them, and whether the people who went in and did not come back would have made a different choice if they had known what was waiting. Subscribe. Leave a comment with which of these tombs you would open first, and tell us where in the world you're watching from.